My name is Guntis Jakovins. I work in Latvia as a backend developer, and I really care about testing. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Codeception and why it's next best thing since sliced bread. First, how many here have ever used Codeception or tried it or looked at it? Nobody. All the big hat fans here. When I started first as a testing guy, I tried to figure out all the things about test types and how to do them properly. And the more I did my research on testing, the more confused I got. Because if you talk to some people, that they say that there's like acceptance tests and there are unit tests and something. If you talk to somebody and say or confuse phrases like integration tests and functional tests, they get really mad at you, while the definition really depends on basically Wikipedia entry. And it's really confusing. I listed here some of the tests. You can see all the 99 definitions of all the test types that we could possibly define. That's also not a full list. There's lots more. But this is a problem because we have multiple types of tests and we trying to solve each of these problems with a separate tool. And what ends, at the end, what happens is we are using only some of the tools, but not implementing full testing suite. Good example is regression tests and acceptance tests. So by definition, there's not really a difference between those two, because basically all acceptance tests make sure that there's no regression. But the problem is that we have special tools to test regression, and then we have special tools for acceptance testing. Same thing goes about accessibility testing. It's still acceptance criteria that sites should be accessible. So we still should use the same tool that we use for testing acceptance criteria. To simplify things, we can divide these 99 test types in 3 categories. And first one would be any test that involves opening up browser and going through the site. So we usually call it acceptance test, and we have few ways to do that. So we have, in Drupal core, we have browser test and JavaScript test, which is kind of the same. JavaScript test just implies that the JavaScript will be available and you will test it. How many here has written any core acceptance test? Yeah. Yeah, and BHAT. We have BHAT for acceptance tests. So that's the usual case. How many here have written BHAT tests? Okay. Well, 5 times more than core tests. But yeah, that's the tool that we have basically grown up with and used for testing, because it's quite easy. It's human readable. You can easily write what you want to test, and basically at the end, you can execute the test on any environment. Then we have visual regression tests. There's multiple frameworks for that. Basically, taking image and comparing if the site is in the same state, so your changes didn't break anything. But still, this involves opening up browser and checking things. So we can bundle up these things together. Next, we have functional and/or integrational tests. Basically, this means we don't open up browser necessarily, and we check the subtasks that are executed in this case, Drupal. So we can check if once cron runs, is everything set to the correct places, and was the queue jobs done correctly? Does storage work as we expect it to work? If we create an entity, and there should be some trigger event, has this event happened? If we use Elasticsearch, we need to check if Elasticsearch has stored our data correctly. Was the normalization process normal? For this, we kind of don't have much choice. We have in Drupal core kernel test base and entity kernel test base. There's no good tool for that. Like there's no good third-party tool to test these functions, especially in Drupal, because of the way how Drupal is built. So this there's a problem, and we don't have any good way to solve this problem. So we usually skip it or do things with different tools and try to bend it so it appears like functional testing. And then, of course, there's unit tests, which basically checks if your methods return things correctly when you give it some data. And this is great. This in Drupal core, of course, there's unit tests. The whole core is tested with unit tests, and we should provide at least some unit tests for our custom modules. But we usually skip that because it's painful. It's really painful to do these unit tests, to spend time on writing a test for your code that it's 3 lines, but you have to write much more longer unit test to test it if it works correctly. And here comes Codeception. The big problem of these all tools that we could use for acceptance tests, for functional tests, and for unit tests are they are separated. So if you're using Behat, you have separate folder with Behat tests. If you are creating some functional tests, you might store it maybe in Behat and do some tricky job there. You might create your functional kernel tests and store them with your modules. There's no way to know how you have tested it and where the tests are stored. And of course, unit tests, they belong with their code base. So basically, when you have a file that does something, you have basically next to it test file for that. And it's a big mess. How Codeception solves this problem? Codeception is a testing framework that provides suites of test types. You can have all these tests in a single framework, in single style. You don't have to switch your coding language. You don't have to switch basically anything. If you want to do acceptance tests, visual regression tests, functional tests, or unit tests, you just use this one tool, but divide it by the suites and do separate configuration per suite. So what is Codeception? Codeception is written in PHP, and it's quite easy to read. It's not human readable, it's code, but it is readable. If you take off all the extra things that PHP requires, then it's quite readable, and the output definitely is human readable of these tests. Codeception can have multiple integrations and backends. Mainly, you can easily switch from Selenium, webdriver, to Phantom.js, or execute your tests in a remote server. So you can connect to browsertesting.com and execute your test there. There's no limit what you can use in the backend. Codeception is great for data insertion in before tests and database cleanups. So basically, you can do things to make sure that you have correct data set in your database, which is a big problem while testing Drupal, that you don't have data, or you have data that shouldn't be corrupted at the end for your next test. Codeception can handle these cases and can execute things before whole suite, before test, after failed test, or basically on any event that happens in the test case. Codeception has numerous integrations. Codeception was not designed for Drupal. Codeception was designed for PHP frameworks, but it can do much more. So numerous integrations include Symfony, Laravel, WordPress, and now Drupal. There's a longer list on the site, but yeah, there's multiple modules that supports testing basically any PHP-based framework. It works great with your continuous integration system. We are using it on Travis. It works perfect. We have this data setup from Codeception. So Codeception sets up data in Travis that should be there in Drupal tests. And we just execute our tests against this newly created instance, and then basically destroy Drupal once we're done. Codeception executes PHP unit natively, so it's based on PHP unit. It uses PHP unit 7, which is bigger than Drupal core. Drupal core, I think, right now has support for PHP unit 6. So yeah, as I said, it's easy to write this code. It's BDD style, scenario driven. And what's more important, it's object-oriented code. So you have classes of test scenarios, and the methods are the tests. And you can easily extend your tests. You can modify in your extended cases. You can have helper methods right there and then to do multiple things. Basically, you have options to write logic for your tests rather than sticking to some predefined things. It has Gherkin syntax support. So for those of you who love to write behat tests, you can do it in Codeception. So by default, the Codeception is written in plain PHP, but you can enable Gherkin syntax support just by enabling module, and write your scenarios in this human readable format, and ask for your clients to define test scenarios. And that can coexist together with all other suits that are defined in PHP code. So you can have your PHP unit tests that are plain PHP tests. You can have then in the same framework these behat tests that are human readable format, and then another test suite that can execute visual regression tests, then another suite. Basically, you get the point. You can define your own suites and do anything you want. More important is how you interact with this system. So first of all, if you are not using Gherkin syntax, if you are using plain PHP, the biggest advantage of it is that you have code completion in your IDE. So you have all your methods basically completed for you, and which is not the case when you write in Gherkin syntax, and you might make like small spelling mistake and not notice and try to figure out why your tests are failing. Yeah, that cannot happen with Codeception, as your IDE will yell at you before you even run anything. Yeah, it's modular. The best thing about this tool is that it's modular, and you can use any module that's included already in Drupal in Codeception. But you can use other people's modules. You can define your own modules. You can publish them and reuse them in other projects. Element matching, it's just like jQuery, but better, because you can say that you want to see element by its CSS, or by its name, by its XPath, by its label, by the text, and basically by anything. And yeah, it has configurable environments. So you can define some variables that, for example, if you're running these tests locally, you will have probably different port addresses or a different domain address, which you want to test. If you're running it on Circle CI, it will have some different configurations. So we have their environment configurations. So how do you write a test? This is the simplest case that I could have figured out. So yeah, you have just simple class, which has one public function, and so the front page works. So this test simply goes to front page and verifies that you can see text home. As you can see, the tests are written in first person. So I go there, I see that, I validate that. So it's really easy to understand what happens in this test case. So this is what I'm talking, that this is BDD styled framework. So, and then you execute it by running and displaying steps. and you have output of the test showing that, yeah, I am on this page, I see home, tests are passed. So how do you set up Codeception for your project? So Codeception is in packages, so you can just compose a require Codeception. Make sure you make it a dev requirement. You shouldn't have any tests executed in production or even the possibility to execute them. And then you run codecep bootstrap, which basically generates this list of files, which seems a lot, but once you get a hold of it, it's not that many files there. So I have highlighted acceptance, functional, and unit. So these three folders, they are suites. And you have your acceptance tests in your acceptance folder, functional tests in functional folder, and unit in unit folder. You have data folder for if you need to use file, insert file in some field in your tests. You can store it right there. If you need image to compare, so visual regression tests, for visual regression tests, you need images to compare against. It will be stored in data. In environments, so envs folder, you have your multiple environments. So you have, in this folder, we have Circle CI configuration, but basically if you have other places where you need different configuration, you can just list multiple configuration files, and then just once you are running your tests, you just indicate your environment variable. In logs, we have all the log files. So we have screenshots, we have reports, we have failed test screenshots, we have comparison images, and so on. So basically, anything that comes out from Codeception goes to this log folder. So, and the great thing about this is that in Circle CI, you can define your artifacts, and you can check if your tests fail, the artifacts will be collected. So if you point to collect these log files, you will be able to then see the screenshots of what was happening on the Circle CI once the test ran, and why it failed, and go through also some log entries and see maybe there's something more there. In support, we have helpers, and this might be a bit confusing why it's called helpers, but basically they are modules. They are the same thing as modules. By definition, you get out of the box acceptance, functional, and unit module, because you have created these three suites. Once you create new suite, you have new module with it, where you can write all your helper methods. Right here, I have defined like page elements helper, which I can use in all of my suites. It doesn't matter how it's called. I could use acceptance helper also in unit if it wouldn't make sense, but it doesn't. Yeah, and then we have multiple more complex solutions like page elements and step objects, which basically helps you interact with same elements. So if you have to interact with some Drupal form widget, you can define it in step object how to fill this field correctly. So if you have auto-completion field, you can define what will be done to fill this field. If you have, I don't know, high chart, you can define how you will open up your high chart script and not script, but so your high chart editor, how you will fill it and how you will save it. It can all be done, and then in your acceptance test, you can just say, I fill high chart element. That's it. Yeah, that's about the structure of it. And we have this global configuration file where you just define some configurations for all your test suites, like where does the test folder belong, where's the log file. You can specify log files to be stored somewhere else if you think that's better. There's a better place for them. You can set your memory limits. You can, by default, enable some of extensions. And each suite has its own separate configuration file. So in this case, it's acceptance suite. So acceptance suite, as you can see, modules enabled. The first module that there is webdriver. So basically a Selenium running in the background. And we can specify which will be the base URL, what type of browser we want to use, do we want to restart between sessions, where's the host of Selenium instance, what will be the window size by default. You can change it while testing, but by default it will be this. And then as you can see, there's a helper acceptance module, because that's the module. So all of these are modules. So if you would like to create new module, you just create new file in the same directory as all helpers, and reference here what's the class name of your module, and automatically your user gets the methods that are available or what you have defined in these modules. Drupal Codeception modules that comes from by default is this list. I have highlighted, so PHP browser, REST, and WebDriver. They are like essential. You cannot live without them. But yeah, you have multiple other options like testing your memcache, doing things in your database, FTP. Yeah, so options are limited, and this comes by default with this simple composer require codeception. What these modules define, as I said, they define these methods that you can use as user. So this is like 1/3 or 1/4 of the whole list what WebDriver provides. I didn't want to place all the methods there. But yeah, as you can see that there's like I_see method, I don't see link, I execute JavaScript, I wait for JavaScript, I wait, move forward, move back, and so on. There are also, besides modules, there are utilities. These are just helper utilities that you can use. They don't belong to the same user. You just call the basically usually static methods on these utilities. For example, fixtures. So you can, before tests, you can prepare some data and hold that data in fixtures, and then later on retrieve it from fixtures and use them. Locator is just an easier way to build XPaths to your elements, especially useful in Drupal because of the structure, how the markup comes out. Mocks, of course, for our PHP units. And then there are extensions. So you can have recorder, which records all your sessions. This requires for you to have WebDriver module enabled. Yeah, you can have logger that logs some things differently. You can have a simple reporter, and you can have, of course, as the same with utilities and as the same is with these extensions. You can create your custom extension, and this is a great thing that if, for example, you need different type of reports, if the basic 5 types that comes in Codeception doesn't really meet your acceptance criteria, then you can extend one of these reporter extensions and implement things differently and have reports in the way that you like. The thing about this Codeception was that for a long time it was really hard to integrate it in Drupal. There wasn't a good way to make it useful, because basically previously we could have had acceptance tests that basically doesn't integrate into Drupal. It just opens up Drupal application and goes through it, and we couldn't actually check if in the backend things are working correctly. We couldn't insert things. So what has happened, we have wrote Drupal Codeception module that will integrate Codeception with Drupal, and like this module's name is Drupal Codeception, and first module in this stack is called Drupal Bootstrap, and it does what its name suggests, just bootstraps to Drupal. So before the tests are running, you're bootstrapped to Drupal, and you can have full access to API of Drupal instance that you are running. So you can create entities right there in your tests. You can check things in database. You can run cron. You can do basically whatever you do in your modules. You can do the same thing here, but here you would just test if that thing works correctly. Yeah, this module has support for multi-sites, so you can test multi-sites with single Codeception instance, but have separate suits for your each of your site. But still, you would have this one suit here. There are these configurations, like you can specify where your Drupal root is. By default, you don't have to specify anything. By default, you have to just specify Drupal Bootstrap. That's it. And you will have default configurations, and it will run out of the box. Drupal Drush, of course, a lot of things happen when we run Drush, and a lot of times we want Drush to be used in our tests. And so the same Drupal Codeception package provides Drupal Drush module that basically provides you with run Drush command. You can simply execute by just typing what kind of thing you want to do in your Drush command. One other helper method is just getting login URI. Just easy way of logging in. If you have already tests for how to fill login form and then log in, it's quite lengthy. So just getting login URI is much easier and faster. Again, these working directory and Drush configurations are only necessary if you are using something not ordinary. By default, you don't have to specify anything. You specify just, I want Drupal Drush, that's it. Drupal entity. This was previously part of Drupal Bootstrap, And then it was decided that it doesn't make really sense to include it all together, as some people might not want to use this instance, or they would like to have their own module that handles entity creation and handling. So it was moved out. So you can right now either enable this module or not, or you can extend this module and make it separate without overriding Drupal Bootstrap itself. What this module does, it allows you to create entities. And why would you want that? Is because it registers all the entities it creates and deletes them after the test. So in this case, if I create entity taxonomy term, I can do whatever with this taxonomy term. I don't have to care about it at the end. I don't have to worry what happens if my test fails and I don't clean up my data. It will be deleted after the test or suite, depending on how I configure this module. Again, by default, no configuration necessary. It's just here so you know that you have possibility to configure it differently, to run it on like cleanup. Should it run on failed tests, or should it not run if tests failed? Should it run after suit? Should it run after each test? Yeah, and of course you can do entity cleanup right there and then in your test, in the middle of everything. If you have created something and you need to test what happens if these entities are no longer there, you can do entity cleanup, and those entities won't be there, and then you can continue with your test. Yeah, you can register test entity by URL. So if you go in, fill form, create some media entity, you can register the entity by URL. So I grab from current URL and register it, or you can just get the entity so you can interact it. So if you create some entity and then you want to check if things are set correctly, although you fill the form correctly, is the backend thing working correctly, you need to get a hold of that entity, and this is the way you can do it. Drupal users are, again, separate thing from entity, although Drupal users are entities. You can get better user handling, which does some things quite similarly as Drupal entity module. It cleans up all the created entities afterwards. So you can, let's say, I log in as this user, or I log in with role administrator. So what will happen is, if you haven't registered already this user in this system, in this Drupal user module, it will create new user with fake name and fake password. It's completely random. Assign it to role administrator and then log you in. So when you start your tests, if you need to check some internal forms, you just log in as some role and you're already there. You don't have to fill the form or do the registration form, do some other things before you do before you actually start the test. Drupal Watchdog also. So this whole thing about these are modules for the same package. What we discovered was that tests could run successfully and everything looks okay, and it turns out that everything wasn't okay, that there are things happening in Drupal backend that should not happen. So one of the things that we can do is check our logs. So before before we finish the test, we go in and check if there was any notice, any warning, or anything happening in the backend while we did this task. So you can, of course, configure when what kind of notices will generate error. Like PHP, you can define that PHP only generates error if it has warning. You can ignore notices, although you shouldn't. But yeah, this is really useful also when you have tests that fail. So if you do some things and tests fail, you can, this will automatically spit out all the watchdog logs, and you will see right there and then basically PHP stack trace of errors. So you don't have to repeat the task or go somewhere to try to figure out what happened, why does this test fail. You will have it in your console logged that this error happened. And the last one is Drupal fields utility. So the biggest pain is filling forms. It's nightmare, especially with paragraphs. So if you have nested paragraphs and you have entity browsers, so paragraph in paragraph, at the end there's entity browser which opens up modal window in which is iframe, and it's nightmare for any acceptance tester, and it's really hard. So what we figured out is that there's a pattern how Drupal creates these field attributes, and we can leverage that. We can create the same thing. So we can have a paragraph object that would represent our paragraph, and we can nest in it another paragraph. So basically copying what's happening in our form, so paragraph in paragraph, we can create paragraph object that would be Codeception fields utility object, and in it you would have another paragraph, and then you could ask that paragraph that's inside other paragraph, what's your path? How can I get to you? And it will respond with the correct XPath for that object. And so yeah, it kind of helps with adding some paragraphs, filling simple titles, getting the next paragraph, getting current subforms of paragraphs, inserting them into entity browser step objects, and doing complex tasks, because now we can, because it's an object. It's not just simple string that doesn't know where it exists, where it was, and what it has done, and what should it do. It's now an object that can respond to us, and so we can do more complex things. The main point of this is, this might sound all complex, but the thing is, you can start with these simple tests. I go to page, I check home button is visible, I can see some text, but soon enough, especially in Drupal, that's not going to be enough. You will quite fast want to do much more complicated things, and you will have to figure this out. So we're here for you for that, and Drupal Codeception module definitely will help you with that. It has some documentation. Well, it has basically all documentation that you need. This module will be definitely upgraded more with, like currently we have no really good way to fill in WYSIWYG editor. that's really painful. But yeah, we're planning to do a Drupal acceptance module that would handle filling entity browsers automatically. You just pass in what type of entity you want to fill and file you want to add in there, or what thing you want to do, basically. And yeah, so this kind of interaction. So it will definitely become better, but currently it's already in really, really usable state. It has helped us a lot. We have caught numerous core issues with this, using this tool, like the last upgrade from 8.5 something core to 8.61 had issue with entity browser JavaScript. Although we didn't test explicitly for does this thing correctly works, these test cases caught that basically on the first click, in some cases, the entity browser doesn't open up. It's a small thing. It's completely small thing, but I think it's annoying for client. I think you get like doubts from the client side if he's clicking something and something's like bit frustrating, and then you have next thing that's bit frustrating. So these tests can help you with that, and these tests can help you in all the forms and ways that you can imagine. Big thanks to our sponsors. Give them a round of applause, I think. And yeah, that is it from me. I think we have 2 minutes if there's
Yeah, we have 3 minutes, or 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Guntis.
It seems an awesome tool, actually. And I have a question that how do you use it in your day-to-day work? Do you have some kind of build pipeline where you integrate this thing?
Yeah, so basically what we try to do is kind of like test-driven development, which this exact fields utility tool allows us to do. So we can define that like there will be fields page element, and after that only we go in Drupal and create this field page element. And then we have in our local environment, we are using Lando for our sites, which comes with Docker container. Well, you can compose your Docker containers. We have Selenium container separately, and yeah, basically we run it from our app container, and it executes things in Selenium and just returns the responses. We can do that locally, or we do it before we push it. If we test like just one thing, if we're testing all the 100 things that there are, it takes around an hour or so. So we push it to Circle CI, and in Circle CI we have 6 parallel nodes, and they are executed in parallel. Plus some things are better cleaned up than in Lando. So it takes around 5.5 minutes before GitHub or Circle CI sends us a message that tests have failed and you failed miserably.
One last question.
Can you use it as a data generator for your development, for example?
Yeah, you can.
It seems perfect.
It's
for this.
like it's not supposed to be, but yeah, you can. Yeah, you can do
okay.
it. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.